I was just, it's a good thing it wasn't an orange tea or UJA would have to toss you off.
All right, so here we go. I got somebody waiting here. Okay. All right, so fruit gardening in our area, North Georgia. We're going to talk about the tree fruits and the smaller fruits, the berries. This is a nice kind of table, a good reminder. If we're new to fruit gardening, there are plants that we are more likely to have success with than if we just jump in with, say, the stone fruits, or yeah, probably more just the stone fruits tend to be a little bit more difficult, more challenging, and that's mostly because of the disease and insect pressure on them. But just about anybody can grow a fig, can grow muscadines. So if you are a novice gardener, I would say start with those, have some success, learn some things, and then maybe move over to that middle column. And if you're really feeling daring, you know, try some things in that third column. I put some peaches in and some apricots, and you know, I've had somewhat limited success. So the plants will grow. I think that's important to remember, is the plants will still grow. It's just, do you actually get fruit that's not riddled with disease or bugs? So, but an apricot tree just by itself is still a beautiful plant if you just want a tree in the yard. Site requirements, obviously full sun, and this is 8 hours of full direct overhead sunlight. Less than this, you're probably going to have less than optimal fruit production, probably increased disease pressure, because you know it's likely that these plants are not going to be drying out because they're not getting exposed to the sun. Pretty self-explanatory there. But you know, especially these fruits, they need that sun exposure to ripen up, to color up, to get those sugars. So you know, you probably will still get some fruits in, say, less than 8 hours, but it may not be as quality. A fig is probably one of the few that will do okay in maybe, you know, 6 hours of direct sun, but again, you're going to have less fruit. Well-drained soil, but not soggy. You know, standing water is to be avoided. So spend some time on that soil, amending if possible, prior to planting. And we live in an absolutely terrific area for fruit garden. Aside from the diseases and the humidity, we have a wonderful area in that, gosh, we can walk the yard and eat fresh fruits pretty much from April until November, depending on when our first frost is. This year we were eating strawberries in April, you know, and we're still pulling off apples. So, and muscadines. So this is just an idea to, you know, think about diversity. There's a whole lot beyond maybe the stuff that we're familiar with or the stuff that we're used to. And, you know, I feel like the more diversity you have, you know, maybe you have a bad year with one plant, but surely you're not going to have a bad year with everything. And especially if you have some of the easier things out there. So. Sort of talked about this. Varieties are important. So spend some time learning about the different varieties. You know, a lot of our grocery store varieties are not always the easiest to grow for us here. You know, and probably Honeycrisp apples are the prime example there. They are not an easy apple to grow in Georgia. You know, they were developed by the University of Minnesota. So that should probably tell you something. They're not going to be as easy down here. And that's the same with a lot of our plants. There are going to be varieties that are more tolerant or more resistant to a lot of these diseases. Insects, chances are you're probably going to deal with the insects no matter what variety. pH is important. That baseline nutrients are important. You know, your potassium, your phosphorus. So please do a soil test before you set out new plants, before you even buy new plants, because you know, amending for pH, establishing some baseline levels of phosphorus and potassium can take months And you don't want to try to do that, a week or so before you're actually planting these plants. So, you know, can't stress that enough. Do that early. And then, after you kind of get to that point where you have a relatively good pH, your baseline nutrients are there, maybe just check on your soil every 3 years or so with a follow-up soil test. And like this picture of little Graham here, this was, gosh, maybe 3 years ago now. The more investment you make in these plants early in their life is going to pay dividends as you and your plants age in the landscape. So, the proper planting techniques, the training of the limbs and things like that, it's going to make this a lot more pleasurable and fruitful experience for you. So spend some time those first couple years, and it might be worth thinking about, maybe not overshooting yourself. So not putting out too many plants that you can't invest all this time in those first couple years. So a couple trees this year, and then maybe if you get things right, a couple more trees later. So and with all of our plants, but especially these, these are perennial plants. I inherited some apple trees that are now my age. They're 40 years old. So these are multi-generational plants for the most part. The more we can reduce that competition from weeds, especially from Bermuda grass, the better off they're going to be. So a good deep layer of mulch, at least out to the drip zone, from day one is highly recommended. And knowing that we're not professionals, we're hobbyists, I think we just need to adjust our expectations for what our fruit is going to look like at the end of the day. So we need to accept some imperfections and accept that some years we can do everything right and we can still have failures or challenges because of the weather or the stink bugs or something like that is going to kind of be out of our control. I sort of talked about this here already. We'll talk about why weather conditions can have a big impact, and that again goes back to choosing the right varieties. Learning how these plants fruit is also important. Oftentimes the fruit buds are formed on last year's wood if we're here looking at the spring and wanting to do our pruning. So learning how to prune properly can mean the difference of having good fruit set and absolutely no fruit set. So in general, apples are going to fruit on wood that's 2 years and older. Peaches and plums are going to fruit on just last year's wood. And so eventually on say a peach or a plum, that interior of that tree that's older than 2 years is really unfruitful wood. It's just kind of structural wood at that point. You're continuing to grow out and your fruit is set on just last year's wood. So that makes summer pruning important because you want to shorten that current season's growth to make sure that fruit is being carried a little bit closer to the structural wood that can hold up that weight. I've got some pictures of what I do at the house. I think some of you have been by there and seen some of the progression here, but when I started, this was 2 acres here, and aside from some really old trees, which have been fun to learn on, I really didn't have a lot, and I needed a landscape. It was kind of a weedy grass mix. So I needed a landscape, as any self-respecting county agent and horticulturalist would. And, my experience with gardening was always, it's more fun when you can eat it. So I set about incorporating fruiting plants in with what would look like a traditional landscape. So from 2015 to fall last year, these are blueberries here. There's about 30 of them. So really not a large area to have, 30 blueberry bushes. They're planted about 4 to 5 feet apart in 3 rows. I think it's important to remember as you're setting out your landscape and your plans is think about your tools. how is your spacing going to affect your ability to get your mower in places, to get your weed eater in places and things like that. So I try to space things out so I can still get my mower in between here and get my mower in between here. And my mower can go around and still make that turn here. So I could probably get things even, you know, closer together, but that's going to make my management and my my use of tools that much more difficult. So always think about that. And this planting here, which from the aerial looks like, you know, more or less an ornamental planting, this is a row of stone fruits here. So 2 peaches and 3 apricots. There's a big fig down here. There's a fig over here on the corner. There's still young pecans here in each corner. And these are 3 Japanese persimmons here. And there's now 3-4 Japanese persimmons and a pomegranate bush along here. Still irises and daylilies and all those, you know, pretty things that make the neighbors slow down when they drive by. But, you know, to me, it's a more productive landscape, and it looks very nice. Where I had just 4 old standard size apple trees, I've got some good pictures of what they used to look like here. I finally gave up on them, and in the place of where just 3 of them went, you can see here, I now have 12 apple trees on improved rootstock. That's going to be a semi-dwarfing rootstock instead of the old standard, you know, wants to be a 30-foot tall tree. These should top out at about a 12 to 15-foot tree. And I've also top worked most of them, so now I have 2 varieties. So here I have 12 trees, about 20 varieties, where before I had just 3 trees and 2 varieties. So there are things that we can do, improvements that we can make to make you know, our fruit gardening more pleasurable and extend that season, and make things easier for us maintenance wise. These big old trees on standard size roots are not easy to manage. They are too vigorous. And that's why, like with our plant sale this year, I'm not even offering apples, because the nursery we work with doesn't offer apples on semi-dwarfing rootstock. So I'm not going to put standard size trees out there in the public's hand that, you know, in another 5 years, they're going to ask me, what the heck were you doing selling me a tree this big? So down here, we've got some muscadines. We've got some semi-trailing blackberries, some more muscadines, blackberries, raspberries, and then this is the vegetable spot. So the key for me is, you know your soil. Always try to improve both the structure of your soil. So organic amendments worked in, you know, as wide and deep as possible, not just to the planting hole. Good deep layers of mulch. You can see this is all just, you know, tree service wood chip mulch everywhere for weed control and for soil improvements. And knowing your varieties, and knowing also that landscapes are not static. If we're trying to incorporate these into the landscape, as I said, I've got 2 young pecans here in the corner. Eventually, those pecans, I hope, will start to shade out this area, and it's going to change the dynamics of what I grow here and what I expect to be able to do with at least, you know, probably half of both of these spots. Here's my score sheet, not bragging, but I think it's good to think about, in that, you know, I have 2 acres, and you guys can see the aerial. There's still a ton of grass there. There's a ton of grass still at my house. And I've got this many fruit plants out there. About 56 apple trees, 6 pears, 3 apricots. You know, there is a lot of diversity in this landscape that from 1,000 feet up still looks a lot like a traditional 2-acre lawn. So you can have a lot out there and still have a lot of grass to mow if you're into growing grass. Here's that view from when I started. Again, this was a 40-year-old house. Had the big clump of pampas grass up the driveway, like most houses from that era did. And this was when I first started this whole planting. And all I really did was just spray the grass and bury it in chips, about 6 to 8 inches deep. buried in chips, and then went in later and started setting plants in. And this is what it looked like this spring. I think this was back probably May, 1st of June. So, you know, you'd never know that there were fruit plants hidden in there because everything just sort of looks nice from a commercial or residential landscape type of view. And there are things that can make this even easier for you with a little bit of work. So there might be some infrastructure to where you can, well, if you want muscadines or some of the vines, you're going to have infrastructure. But you can use infrastructure for, you know, trellising apples, pears. You can even trellis figs, do a espalier with figs. So, and more aggressive type pruning, knowing when to prune to keep plants smaller and more manageable is, you know, of course, advised. And this all kind of sort of finally sunk in with me in trying to recover these old unmanaged apple trees on standard size roots. You know, I'm spending, I don't know how many weekends those first couple years, 15 feet off the ground, my arms and legs wrapped around big branches with, you know, a cordless reciprocating saw above my head. And I thought, this is silly. You know, there's no need for me to risk bodily injury trying to manage a tree that really kind of makes ugly apples anyway. So think about that. Also think about how much time and physical ability you might have 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So this is what I hope to sort of plan for, is that I'm using true dwarfing rootstock. There are 35 apple trees here, spaced about 2.5 feet apart. So these are more like, if we think about a root system, these have a root system about like a tomato plant instead of, you know, a big 40-foot tall tree. So yeah, it's probably going to be a little bit more attention to water and fertility management, but the pruning, the training, and also the spraying, you know, this is going to be a two-dimensional row of trees. So, you know, I can just walk down this row with my backpack sprayer and do a pretty effective job, far more effective than I can do on a, you know, a traditional type of apple tree, especially one that's 15 foot to 25 foot tall. So, all right, so if we're talking fruits, we have to understand too that a lot of our fruit plants need cross-pollination to effectively set fruit or to set more fruit or bigger fruit. So if we're talking about our small fruits, they don't really need cross-pollination for the most part, except for our muscadines, our hardy kiwis, I guess elderberries. Elderberries are all in vogue right now with flu control and everything else, but you would need 2 varieties there. But your blackberries, your raspberries, your strawberries, you know, just go with 1 variety if you like it, and you should do just fine. Same with our figs. You don't need cross-pollination on the figs. With our tree fruits, however, apples and pears, you absolutely will need cross-pollination, with some exceptions. With horticulture, with science, there's always a few exceptions to every rule. Peaches, you can just try out 1 peach, and I would suggest maybe just trying your hand if you're new to peaches, maybe just putting in 1 plant and seeing how it goes. Sweet cherries are not recommended for the most part, although Mr. Lawson up in Ballground has some sweet cherries that somehow you know, do quite well for him, but you know, he's a bit of an anomaly and a fruit expert. Most of us are not. So there's a few tart cherries, Montmorency and Valentin, might do well, although they're probably not going to be something that lives very long for you just because of our disease pressure. So if we're talking about the results from your soil test, hopefully you've done a soil test and you're not just putting out lime without that information. But we know that dolomitic lime raises pH. By and large, our native soils that are unamended are going to run in the low 5s. I've seen soil samples come into our office that are low 4s. So if you are new to a site, this is important stuff to figure out. It's almost unbelievable, some of these that come in the office where they cut down pines, seeing soil samples come in the low 4s. That's almost apple cider vinegar level. So dolomitic lime, and the benefit there is you're also getting some calcium increase and some magnesium increase. You know, but again, this stuff is very immobile and takes a while to start activating and neutralizing acidity. So we want to have this in well before planting if possible. And you really only get one shot because of the immobile nature. If, you know, 2 years after planting, your plants are struggling and then you want to add some lime, I mean, it might change the pH down about that deep. So getting this right from the get-go is highly critical. So with blueberries, there may be a case, and this is probably only going to be with blueberries, where you may want to lower pH. And we would do that with elemental sulfur. It is a lot harder to lower pH than it is to raise pH. So you never want to get in a situation where you have elevated pH. It's, you know, it's at 7 or well above, because getting it to go back down is a little bit more of a crapshoot. So always soil test, and getting this stuff worked in and incorporated, and even with our potassium and our phosphorus, getting it worked in prior to planting, hopefully to a depth of 8 inches if you can till or work the soil that deep, and that's not always the case in some of our soils. Chill hours are critically important, and they are variety dependent. You can see the range on apples can be 300 hours to 1200 hours. So we want to match a variety that has a chill hour requirement that is on average what we get in our area. Blueberries, most of the rabbit-eye blueberries are going to be well suited for our area. Peaches is another one that has a wide range. So again, you want to match one that has about the average that we need, maybe a little bit lower than too high. We don't probably want to stretch and put in something that's going to require 1200 chill hours, because we may not get that every year. And I'll show you some examples of kind of what we're talking about here in a second. So if you're wanting to figure out exactly where we're at with chill hours, if you have family somewhere else and you don't know what maybe to recommend to them, GeorgiaWeather.net has a calculator function, and we have something like 80 weather stations around the state. You can type in that chill hour calculator function, and it'll spit out the last year and hopefully the last 3 years. Our ball ground station probably doesn't have 3 full winters of chill hours behind it yet. But essentially a chill hour is a resting period in dormancy where temperature is below 45 degrees and above freezing. So below 45 and above freezing is a chill hour. And that's in that dormancy period. That's just setting that plant in dormancy, allowing it to sort of rest and recuperate before it starts to swell buds in the spring. All right, so we have that time period there that's set by that variety that says it needs, say, 800 chill hours. Okay, we get 800, 900 chill hours. And when I use this calculator, and it's good for you guys if you do go to use it, I try to set the time period, say, end of November, maybe middle to the end of November, to about March 1. Because in general, you know, we might get some colder nights in November, but it's really not, the plants are shut down, they're not fully dormant. We only want to count hours when they're fully dormant. And then as spring starts coming, those plants are probably already accumulating heating units as well. So we don't want to just set the chill hour calculator for the entire year. We just want to set it for the normal kind of dormancy period. And so if we have, say, a plant that needs 800 chill hours, and we get 800 chill hours from December to middle February, and then we get a warm patch there the end of February, that plant has met its resting period. It's starting to warm up. that plant is programmed to think, okay, now it's springtime. We get a few weeks of 65-degree highs. That plant is going to start coming out of dormancy and swelling buds and then working down the road towards flowering and fruiting. So, however, and where we can run into problems with choosing the wrong varieties is if we have a plant that only needs 400 chill hours. Some years we may have 400 chill hours by January, and then we get that warm patch. And then it's going to come out of dormancy, and invariably we're going to have a frosty night, a cold week, and then that plant is going to be set back. And that's why a lot of times the stone fruits, because they're going to bloom out early anyway, they're especially prone to, you know, that spring killing frost. So if you're going to go with the stone fruit, at least choose one that has a higher chill hour requirement to avoid that killing frost. That's sort of a graphical form of what I just talked about. This is more of an issue if, I guess it could happen here if we just have a really weird winter, or if we plant a variety that's, say, suited for upstate New York, that maybe needs 1,200 chill hours and we don't get 1,200 chill hours. You will have a lot of those buds just won't come out of dormancy. So it looks like this plucked chicken. It's just not going to come back as vigorous, set as much fruit, and even break as many of the leaf buds as well. So that's more of a risk in middle to South Georgia with their milder winters. If we're talking about, you know, I always get the call if we have that cold snap, how can I protect my plants? If we have, you know, just 1 or 2 frosty nights in a row, it's important to remember that we're really not as worried about a frost. It's more a really cold chill, you know, that 28 degrees. That's well below what most frosts are going to be. So 28 degrees is kind of that critical temperature where we're going to lose blossoms, where we're going to lose early fruits. But that's also not always the case, because, you know, it can go a couple degrees even lower than that if, say, it's windy. I swear every year I get worried about my blueberries because, you know, they bloom kind of mid-March most years, and we always have frost. And I've never had what I can tell is a loss in fruit on my blueberries. So 28 degrees is about what we're most concerned about, but I think most of the time we're probably not going to have much loss. We got pretty close this year. I think, you know, up north of us, they might have had some loss with that early May frost we had there that first weekend in May, but nothing around here that I know of. I talked about this soil testing. I won't say it again, but it is important. If you're going to order plants through the mail, and now's a good time to start looking at, you know, say your online catalogs like Stark's Brothers and some of the other tree nurseries that ship plants, you're going to get what looks like a twig with roots. You might be a little bit disappointed in thinking you're going to get a tree, but, you know, you order it through the mail, there's not going to be any soil on there. They're going to ship you a dormant 1-year-old whip probably. So here is what you're looking at. You know, all these plants are grafted. So this is where that plant was either budded or grafted, right here. This is your rootstock, and this is a different variety than your Granny Smith or your Honeycrisp, whatever you're planting up here. This is a different variety. You don't want to grow this. So we want to make sure that we're planting it at about the same depth right here. We want that graft union to be out of the ground, out of reach of you know, the ground and even the mulch, because it can root, your scion can root, and you're going to lose the characteristics of this rootstock if this thing roots, if you plant it too deep. And some rootstocks are worse than others about sending up root suckers. Those root suckers are most oftentimes more vigorous than your scion or your variety. So you want to keep those under control. Yeah, just knowing that we're looking at actually 2 different plants. They're just grafted together or budded in the nursery. We want to dig a wide but not deep hole, a wide hole. We want it to look more like a saucer than a chili bowl. You nice and wide. Hopefully, we've added our amendments. We've changed the pH like we needed to prior to setting this plant in. And then, I use a shovel or a rake to know, I'm setting this at the right depth. Know that if you dig it even deeper than this and then you backfill, as the air pockets are worked out of that planting hole, that plant will sink in, so either plant it a little bit high and expect that settling, or just, don't dig your plant or your hole too deep. Water in thoroughly, again, get all that air away from the roots, settle it in with water at the time of planting, mulch it in, and set to work on training that tree. If we're talking about apples, we want to have a central leader, and know that what you're going to get oftentimes is really just a whip. There's no branches on it oftentimes, and so if we don't start pruning it and training it, it may just keep going up another couple feet before it starts to branch. And we probably want our branches, at about 4 feet above the ground level. So we can trick that plant into giving us some branches at that 4 foot level if we prune. So if we prune, these buds below that pruning cut are going to have auxins develop in those buds. They're going to all think they're the new central leader, and we have to be on the ready to pull some of them down or train them down while leaving one to continue on as the central leader. And you can see this is what it would look like the year after making that heading cut on that whip. So we got some nice well-placed branches, kind of around that 360 degrees if we're looking at it from the top view. We don't want too many, about 3 or 4 in about a foot space on that leader is a good amount of scaffold branches. And then continue on with that leader, and then say another 3 to 4 feet up above the level of this first level of scaffolds. We might want a second level of scaffolds, but I wouldn't make that cut until the following dormancy year. And that's what we're doing here. So this is, say, year 2, after we have a good level or a good number of scaffolds, nice branch angles. He's making another heading cut. So we're going to get another set of scaffolds in this area here. I've tried making these heading cuts where I've had a pretty vigorous tree. I get this out the first year, and that thing just shoots up a huge leader that current season. And I've tried making this heading cut in the growing season. You don't get nearly as much of a response from the secondary buds below that heading cut if you make a summer pruning cut. A dormancy cut will invigorate those buds to become branches, whereas in the season, you might get 1 or 2 that actually come out and form limbs or branches. So just have a plan for, this is year 1 if you're getting a whip. Year 2, you're getting another set of scaffolds, and after that, that's probably all you want anyway for a yard tree. If we're talking about our limbs, there are good angles and there are bad angles. If we're dealing with pears, this is probably what you're going to get most of the time. Pears are notorious for having those bad crotch angles. So we have to be there. Some branches, it's not even worth trying to bend them down. Apples are pretty bad for this too at the terminals. They make these kind of branches that they're just set too close together. I'll just pick one and prune the other one out in that case. However, on a pear, even branches that are not kind of in that chicken foot type pattern, they will still be too upright. And if they're allowed to stay on there, that growth ring starts to set, and you're going to have a compromised limb that is not going to be structurally sound. So we want to get that, training system on there, a weight or something, pretty soon after we start to see that limb develop. I'll show you some strategies for doing that. They make limb spreaders, so you can use these things and kind of push limbs down. I've tried limb spreaders. You don't have to buy these. These are ones you can actually buy. You can make them with like wooden paint stir sticks. They come in 2 foot lengths and 1 foot lengths and 3 foot lengths. They always seem to just pop out in the wind, or you name it at my house. I really like just tying limbs down. I think that's the best way to go if you want to do a good job. I've tried weights. Weights, you have to be really careful on. I think I might have some pictures of weights. Sometimes weights will just break the branch if that branch isn't fully set and allowed enough time to be attached to the tree. So, and I like limb pulling down here, in that you can kind of adjust it and put that limb exactly where you want. With weights, you're just relying on gravity to hopefully just bend it down in the right spot. Sometimes, maybe that branch is not exactly in the right spot on the leader, and you maybe want it more in this space. And so with, a good weight, with a good string, and I use sod staples or a rock, or, tied back to the central leader, you can kind of position your branches a lot better than you can with weights and these limb spreaders. So here's that situation where I talked about trying to make that heading cut to get more limbs in the growing season. You can see I made that heading cut. There's my new leader. And then here's a second set of what, I hoped would be scaffold branches. But because it was summertime, there wasn't as much vigor to push down those growth auxins into these lower buds. So I got a new leader, but I didn't exactly get, a new secondary layer of scaffolds. So, again, this is going to take time. But waiting a year, I had a good layer of primary scaffolds. Just waiting the next dormancy period and then making that heading cut is going to get you a better response for getting a second level of scaffolds, as opposed to trying to do that and really push it in that current growing season. So, but these trees, if you do it right, I mean, this was the current season of a 1-year tree. So prior to this year, I grafted this tree. It grew for a year, and this was the very first year it was planted. So you can, with some good plant material, you can get these things formed and trained and get good growth if you've got all your ducks in a row. If you want to get really fancy, you can do some ornamental type things. Of course, there's the French method of espalier. That image I showed you earlier is this method called oblique cordon. So again, we're kind of tricking the plant to sort of think it's more of a branch than it is a tree. And the vigor and the growth, once that plant reaches its sexual maturity or its fruiting stage, it gets out of vegetative stage, a lot of that vigor comes out of the plant. So hopefully, with some training, with some bending of branches, you're going to have a more fruitful tree earlier in that tree's life. Because if it stays in that juvenile vegetative stage, it's just going to want to put on more growth and make more energy and not necessarily start setting fruit and ripening fruit. So I've seen where they even do some of these espalier methods with peaches. I don't know how you do that, because again, you grow a peach on last year's wood, so this would be a little more challenging, but it could be done. And I really like the old vineyards out in California. This was how they grew wine grapes back before, all the infrastructure of vineyards and trellises and things like that. But it was a method called head training. Obviously not as productive per acre, but looks kind of cool in the garden or even out in the vineyard. So some of our tools, these were my Christmas ornaments one year. They're just concrete with a wire set in them, using old nursery pots. It does work. It does work, but I did lose quite a bit of limbs from them being put on branches that just couldn't take the weight, and it's tough because you put one on there or you put two on there and that tree bends a little bit and you think you're fine, and then you come back a day or two later, and you've just worn out the elasticity in that branch, and that branch is, you know, bending down towards the ground, or it just comes right off. So I really like just tying them down where you can. You may want to have something around the trunk, both for frost protection, you know, especially when these trees are young. You can see how they don't really have bark. You know, this is an apple tree here. That bark is very thin, and it can be exposed to freezing and cracking temperatures. I paint my trunks, and that's why, you know, the old orchards, and I mean, it used to be done even in landscapes, painting the trunks white. So I use an interior latex paint, so it doesn't have some of those fungicides and things like that that might be on outdoor paint. So interior latex paint, any light color works, you know, so it doesn't have to be white, but anything on the lighter spectrum. And I mix in some plaster, you know, so it's 50% water, 50% latex paint, and some plaster to just sort of thicken it up. And it almost has to be put on every year. You can see my trees now, after being painted last winter, there's almost no signs of it being left. So that does, there's some reports and debate that it might also give you some protection against some of our boring insects, you know, with a little bit of reflective type nature to that bark, and a little bit of thickness with the plaster. So, you know, it's not going to do any harm, so it's worth putting on, in my opinion. And I think it's better than trying to put these different wraps. I've seen some folks use like the corrugated irrigation pipe or drainage pipe, I guess, not irrigation pipe, but drainage pipe. Every time I've seen that irrigation pipe or drainage pipe used, you end up with more problems than you do, you know, at least I guess it's used for string trimmer protection, but you're going to get fire ants. You're probably going to maybe even get carpenter ants in there. And to me, it's not worth messing with. So, and you might even have some woolly apple aphids that make their home in there. So, same with these type wraps. I think just painting trunks is better than these type things. But deer will chew on these trunks, voles will chew on these trunks, groundhogs, you name it, rabbits. So you want to have some level of protection, especially if you have a lot of wildlife pressure in your area. All right, well, let's start talking on individual fruits. There's Graham and Shelby. Even the dog likes eating apples, so I'm a big fan. Apples are probably my favorite. They are hardy, multi-generational trees. I think that's one thing that I've enjoyed the most about my job is exploring some of these older trees, learning more about the varieties, but then also families' connection with these trees. Even if, you know, they're just a wine sap, these trees live for a very long time. Sometimes in spite of us, and in spite of, you know, the gardeners that are in charge of them. So I think they're pretty in the spring. They're pretty this time of year when there's fruit hanging on them. So, you know, to me, they're just a nice addition to the landscape, and they give us fruit. And there's, you know, with apples, there's an incredibly long season. We can start eating apples as early as June, all the way into November. And with some of our later apples, you know, they can store for a couple months in the fridge or in a cool basement. So they're just an excellent fruit and an excellent tree. Some of that local history that I really enjoy. This is an older tree. This is Mr. Grizzle here on the right side. So his family's been in Cherokee County for, I think his grandparents or his great-grandparents, quite a long time. He's 70, I want to say 75. So this tree here that there's not much left on was already big enough for him to climb as a boy. So to give you an idea of just how long these trees have been around. So we don't know the name on this tree. You can see it's pretty small, but it's also not exactly in the best of shape. So this apple, you know, under better conditions might be a little bit bigger than this. And this is a second tree not far from the original. So he thinks that this is maybe just the seedling of the original tree that's almost dead. But you can see how this thing has grown. This is Graham just, I think, last summer. but look at these branches here. They self-grafted about 12 feet up. Really just, and again, not being managed, not really being cared for, but still providing fruit, either, as animal feed or for cider or for, a few summer pies or something like that. So I just love examples like this that just prove the resilient nature of these fruits. However, if you want to do a good job and avoid some of the problems that inevitably will come, you have to try to take care of them. And these bigger, older trees, there's a lot to manage. This is, just the annual mess that falls on one of the big trees at my house, the Grimes Golden. You got to get all this stuff off the ground. You're going to deal with some yellow jackets. I'm just making applesauce every time I mow. So, have that in mind and have a plan. Hopefully plant a smaller semi-dwarfing tree to where, 20 years down the road, you're not in a situation like this where you're trying to, just get rid of a mess like this. I figured out a little bit this year. I raked up and filled a lot of buckets with these windfalls and things like that, and the neighbors with horses are glad to take them, because really apples that start falling, inevitably they're going to start having the summer rots, the bitter rots. Unless you use them that day, they're not worth even dealing with, but they work fine as, horse fodder or something like that. So and because they do require cross-pollination, having a strategy to maybe encourage more pollinators in your landscape, in your yard. It doesn't have to be that you need a beekeeper friend to put some hives or anything at your house. You can, put up one of these mason bee nests. I put some of these on the south side of my barn and got mason bees the very first year. And really, that's all I did. I didn't, add more plants or do anything else. It's just put up a home for them and they show up. So, and they're actually some of the best, far better than a honeybee in that they pollinate differently. They don't pack it away into their legs. They just kind of have more hairs and they land on the flower, and the pollen just tends to stick to them a little bit different, and they fly and pollinate when it's rainy and non-optimal, unlike the honeybee. So try to encourage some of our native pollinators. They'll probably do an even better job than honeybees. We want to thin fruit, for managing our apples, and assuming we do a good job and we get these plants off the ground, they will, every blossom will have 5, if not 6 flowers. And if everything goes right, you'll have fruit set. We've got to thin that out, and this is one of the hardest things for hobby gardeners to do, is removing fruit. and I struggled to do this too. You think, oh gosh, I'm wasting all this fruit. I'm not going to see it all, but you can see, look at these clusters of apples. So one, they're not going to get up to as good a size, but primarily you are going to do a poor job of disease control and of insect control. If right here I've got 3 apples that are all clustered and touching, there's more space for bugs to hide. There's more space for that humidity, for those disease spores to just infect that fruit. So we want to thin fruit early, hopefully in that first 30 to 40 days after bloom, and thin it about, hang loose. Think about that. We want a fruit, no closer than that on the branch. And thirdly, if we don't, we may get into a situation where we're actually breaking limbs because of the weight of this fruit. So this is critically important. And if we miss it, we may run into both, increased disease problems, increased fungal problems, insect problems, and structural problems with limbs possibly cracking or breaking. So, and some plants with our apples can have a tendency to be biennial. So they'll have a good year, and then the following year they may not have any fruit set or little to no fruit set. So you can, by thinning, you can hopefully overcome that biennial nature of some of these varieties. Because if a plant is putting all that energy into seed formation, it's not developing as many buds for next year. So when we talk about rootstock, this is the secret sauce for our apples. Even our pears, we don't get as much control with our pears. But you can see the size difference of your standard seedling size apple wants to be about a 30-foot tall tree, whereas some of our semi-dwarfs, if we're talking a 60% size reduction, hopefully we're talking about an 18-foot tall tree. And we have to assume if we're ordering a tree from the big box chain or, Tractor Supply or something, it's a standard size tree. We have to assume that if they don't tell us. Even the M111 is more or less a semi-standard or a very vigorous big tree. I've got a hobbyist friend up in LJ. He's retired now, and he's ripped out a lot of his old M111s that are 12, 15 years old now because they're just too big to do a good job of pruning, of spraying, and of management anymore. So he's going down even smaller, kind of in this M7 category, and even smaller than that with some. This kind of shows you the difference in the field. M7. And M7 is about probably a good height for most of us, but it's about the highest end that you'll see in a commercial orchard. And M7 is about as big as they're going to get up at Mercier's or RNA or something like that. Down even lower, the M26 and the B9. And that first letter is just where it was developed. So M means the malling station. Some of our rootstocks will have a G, and that's for Geneva. The Geneva rootstocks here, I won't spend a ton of time. If you guys have more specific questions on this, I can answer you through email or something. So, and you can see the spacing requirements for a standard size tree versus the semi-dwarf versus the full dwarf. So, again, you get a lot more trees per acre. And I think the important thing is this years to fruiting. 1 to 2 years on some of these dwarfs, whereas that standard size tree that you're going to get at the big box chain, you may wait 7 years before you actually see fruit on that. Nobody wants to wait that long. If we have a question on older trees, I can kind of walk you through what I did with some of mine. Sometimes it's worth just taking a look at, is this tree even worth saving? In this case, this is not a good sign, sort of like that old Grizzle family tree. This tree is never going to really recover from this. It can continue to grow probably for another generation or so, but you're going to always probably have problems with something like that. I won't spend too much time, but you can kind of see what I did on these. Made some major heading cuts, got new branches, started getting some spurs, you can see here. But eventually, again, it was still a tree that was way too big and way too vigorous, so just had the neighbor come over and push him down. I won't talk on grafting. With our pears, to me, a good pear, and that's the caveat, is a good pear. A good pear, in my opinion, beats even the best apple almost any day of the week. However, they're not always all good pears, even from the same tree, and you only have about a week of window where it's possibly a good pear. The rest of the time, it's too hard or it's mush. But I think they're still worth trying and worth growing. Some of the better ones, if we're talking about the European varieties, we have to go for fire blight resistant varieties. Even though this is a Bartlett, the Bartlett tends to be one of the more fire blight susceptible ones. Orient is a fine one. I really like this Moonglow. I really, really like the Moonglow. Seckel pear is a very nice one, almost fire blight proof. It's a little bit smaller, but very, very sweet, very nice. And then our Asian varieties, they're more kind of more similar in texture and use to an apple. They're crunchy. Most of the time they're round like an apple. but they are more fire blight resistant in general than our European types. Very, very nice still. So let's see, we'll talk on stone fruits, but not too long because, you know, again, I'd rather most people not try stone fruits unless they have some experience and want to just try it as something new. So generally in the office, if I have a stone fruit question or if somebody brings me a plum, this is what they're bringing me. What the heck's wrong with this? This is brown rot in plums. We get it in peaches. We almost have to fully commit to a spray program to do a good job with stone fruits, unfortunately. So if we're talking about peaches, generally we're going to be 3 years until the first crop, although, you know, I did get 2 peaches on one of my 2-year-old trees, so it can happen. The challenge with peaches is there's not good dwarfing rootstock. So, you know, again, we have to manage that tree a little bit more aggressively. They are vigorous growers, and we have to do some summer pruning to keep that tree somewhat smaller, because by year 10, that tree can be pretty out of bounds for most of us. But if you can do it right, and I think Mike Lloyd's on this program today, man, he had some great peaches this year. He had some fabulous peaches this year. So it can be done by the hobbyist. You just sort of have to commit to doing things on time and your pruning and training and things like that. So in our area, we're probably going to want mostly the higher chill hour requirements. And that's going to keep them out of, hopefully, that risk of a late frost. We can't grow most of the varieties that they're going to grow in, say, the Fort Valley and Macon area. So we want these ones in the 800 to 1,000 chill hours. So they're probably going to do best for us. We've got spray programs out there. I can show you guys where to find those spray programs for peaches to avoid the brown rot and your cuculio problems. But we're probably going to need to commit to at least 1 or 2 dormant sprays, a bloom spray, because brown rot starts at bloom, and then a few cover sprays beyond that. So plums can do pretty well. I would say plums are easier than peaches. So just get a variety that you know, has the right chill hour requirements. And make sure you get one, if you just put one in that is self-fertile. Even a self-fertile variety is probably going to do a better job of setting fruit with a pollinizing partner, though. So, but you can get some good fruits. My neighbors have good luck with plums across the road, and you know, they might spray 3 or 4 times in a year. So it can be done. Figs, I absolutely love figs. Figs and muscadines, probably my 2 favorite in terms of just ease of growing. Every year, I am just surprised at how many fruits I get for how little attention I have to provide them. About the only problem you're going to have with figs is they can be prone to ambrosia beetles. Ambrosia beetles are a native insect. You know, they may hit your plants. Nothing really you can do about it. But they grow out of it if you just remove the tissue that's affected. You know, the root system is still alive, and it'll send up new shoots, and you can, you know, you might lose figs for a year if you have a severe infestation, but they'll be back the next year. So maybe every 10 years, they might be frosted all the way to the ground. I think the last time they were frosted to the ground was Snowpocalypse in 2014 around here. But I don't think we've had a killing frost enough to really damage figs that bad in the last few years. That's if we go with the right varieties. Those frost hardy, cold hardy varieties, Celeste, Brown Turkey, Hardy Chicago are the most well known. No real diseases. I can show you some pictures of something that I do on mine that I think helps both with fruit ripening and some of the, kind of fruit problems that can come on. I try to prune them around August, I would say, maybe even earlier if you can. The problem I've had on this Celeste at my house this year is I think it was almost too vigorous. So I had too many new shoots. And then out here at the tip, too many split shoots. So it was just too vegetative. I wasn't ripening fruit. I was just, was continuing to grow more wood and more leaves. So we can kind of overcome that by thinning out some of those shoots that are coming out at the tip, pruning out some leaves, sort of trimming that tree to look like an okra bush. If you pick okra, like you cut the leaves and the okra as you go up. I try to do that on my figs, and I started doing it really just to be able to see the fruits in that dense foliage a little bit better, and to make sure I wasn't grabbing a fruit that had a wasp on it. But it also helps ripening fruits. I did this even more severely. This was earlier in the year. I did it again like a week ago. And now I'm finally getting ripe fruits every day. Whereas before it was, every few days, if I was lucky, I had a couple figs on there. So thinning out the growing shoots at the tips if you can, removing any just non-vigorous, smaller stuff on the inside, and just removing leaves where you can. It's not a fun thing to do because, they bleed that latex, and it can be a little bit irritating on your skin, but, put on a long shirt and get in there and do it, because I think you'll get a lot more figs if you do that. And I like figs too, because they're just a great plant to propagate. Very, very easy, nice plant to share with, friends and family. So these were some fig cuttings I took back in March. All I did was put them in this deeper Rubbermaid container with some semi-moistened potting soil. I did wrap them in pear film, but I don't think you have to do that. I put them on a heat mat and just put a cover on top of this thing. And you can see 2 months later, I've got nice little fig plants that, I've given away to a number of people. So easy plant to propagate, make you feel like an expert, and fun to share when you have people come by the house or something like that. Persimmons, really, really like them. I find that a lot of people have an aversion to them, and I think it's always a bad childhood memory of eating a fruit that was not quite ripe. And those are generally our native persimmons that have that astringency. They will make you pucker if they're not quite ripe. However, the Asian persimmons, we can have non-astringent types like this fuyu. The Giro is another one, so it doesn't have to be mush and soft for us to be able to eat it. And they are really nice, very, very nice flavor. It's hard to compare them to something else because they are so unique. A very ripe, astringent type, to me, sort of almost tastes a little bit tropical, kind of like a mango papaya mix. So very nice. And, again, with a lot of things with gardening is I like to grow things that I otherwise couldn't buy at the store, or I couldn't buy as good a quality at the store. And, a persimmon at our grocery stores in the fall, a much smaller fruit is probably going to run you like $1.50 each. So, if you like persimmons, it's worth putting a tree or two in. And they're a nice plant. You can see, there's a picture of a retired guy from here in the office. He worked in environmental health. These are 5-year-old trees in his yard a couple of years ago. Very just beautiful plant. Nice leathery leaves. A few problems, but not bad in terms of insects to be concerned about or something, but not bad. Very nice tree. We put in some after Mr. Magid here brought me quite a few fruits a couple years in a row. So I put some in, and unfortunately, they were fruit plants from our fruit sale. The fuyu plants that we sold that year, I think 2017, at least the ones that I got were maybe mislabeled. You can see the shape of ours here last fall was not like those fuyus, those squatty ones. Still a very nice fruit. Unfortunately, they are astringent. I learned the hard way. So they have to be fully soft, like the native types. I suspect that this is a Hychia, but just one of these 3 trees, I think, gave us like 15 to 20 of these big, big fruits. So worth putting in, especially if you like them. I won't spend a ton of time on diseases because we can kind of talk all day on that. Fire blight susceptibility is critically important with apples, so we want to choose varieties that are more resistant to fire blight. All of them can get it. It's just how quickly it moves through the tissue. So fire blight is a challenge in that it is a bacterial disease. So it often will enter into wounds or into the blossom, and it starts moving through the cambium. And the resistance is just how fast it can move through that cambial tissue. So you have some, like the pear trees, like your Bradfords, where you can get a strike and maybe you haven't been out in the yard in a week and all of a sudden you have fire blight shoots that are 3 feet long. That's susceptibility rating. So, and that's what you see. Very obvious when you see it because obviously it looks like it just got torched with a fire. So. We do have years that are worse than others. I think it was kind of a bad fire blight year this year. I had one variety of apple that got a number of strikes, but most of my other ones didn't. So how it moves around, you know, the insects can move it. That's the challenge with this disease, is it enters into open cambial tissue on the plant, and the blossom is open cambial tissue. So the bugs and the rain and even the wind can move it into the blossom. So we don't really have a good control strategy. You know, I think one of the spray programs recommends a fungicide spray at bloom. You can use, what is it? Streptomycin at bloom. And it's actually an antibiotic labeled for fruit trees. And it gives you, I guess, some level of protection for fire blight, but really prevention just starts with choosing the right varieties and being observant, being present in your orchard or with your trees to know when you've got it and pruning it out when you see it. And when you see it, we want to prune at least 8 inches below where we actually see signs of that disease, because it's probably already moved down into that tissue well beyond where the symptoms are actually evident. So pruning it out, sanitizing our pruning tools, things like that, not handling our trees or doing any pruning when the trees are wet or when there's dew on them can also prevent that spread too. And really fertility management. I don't fertilize my trees beyond that second year. We can fertilize, you know, apples, peaches. Peaches are different. We're not talking about peach disease, but apples are more prone to problems when they are overly vigorous. So aside from getting your phosphorus and potassium right, a 2-year-old and older apple tree, in my opinion, doesn't need a lot of nitrogen or any nitrogen. You can lead to more problems with nitrogen. They're going to make you fruit with or without nitrogen in most cases, especially if you have, you know, slow release nitrogen in the form of your decaying wood mulch and things like that around them. So let's see. This is probably what you're going to deal with more than anything, your summer rots. And this is where cover sprays can help. But these summer rots, man, they can come in and just wreak havoc. It makes that kind of long-term storage or that post-harvest storage capacity for the hobbyist like us almost impossible, because even where you think you've got blemish-free fruit, chances are these conoidal spores are already on there, and they will develop, you know, in a box in the basement sometimes. So have a plan for using your fruit. You know, either have room in the refrigerator, because these diseases don't develop as well post-harvest. And this is the one I'm talking about up here. These are superficial fly speck here and sooty blotch. no problems at all. You've got that on the fruit, you know, it'll do just fine. But this bitter rot here is what really makes your useful window of using that fruit somewhat shortened, and you know, makes a lot of the fruit just sort of rot on the limb. And if allowed to, some varieties, and in some cases, that fruit will just rot and completely mummify on the tree and hang and never drop. So you want to, you know, again, get those symptomatic fruits out of there, hopefully reducing some spread that way. But really, you know, management starts with good airflow, so good training, good pruning, and maybe some cover sprays throughout the summertime. So you can see that one's almost to the point of being mummified. But these conoidal spores are going to live on cankers. They're going to be present, especially the older these trees get. You know, it's pretty easy to grow a good apple or two, you know, the first 5 years. But as you know, the trees age, you start getting some canker development and things like that. You just have an increase of carryover of diseases from year to year. So you really have to kind of stay on top of things early and plan for that kind of disease cycle to increase as years go on. Cedar apple rust, I don't know if you have cedar trees, but it's pretty cool to see them in the springtime, generally about April. You'll notice these just nasty looking things on the cedar tree. Unfortunately, it doesn't hurt the cedar tree at all. But when it gets on the apple, you can get spotting on the fruit. But where it's more likely to cause problems are these leaf spots. And in severe cases, it can defoliate the tree early on. In general, it's more of a problem on the golden type of varieties. You know, so the Golden Delicious, the Grimes Golden family of varieties. So, you know, there's publications, a lot of the fruit nurseries will say, you know, cedar apple rust resistant. So try to choose varieties that are have some built-in resistance, but this isn't as devastating of a disease as, say, bitter rot or fire blight. Table on resistance, you'll see here, and Pristine, I believe, is one of the Purdue Rutgers varieties, and it's a yellow variety, and you'll see, you know, it has a lower rating for cedar apple rust. More information on varieties, we'll go through that. Your pests, you know, you may get some mites on both peaches and apples. Where you're going to probably have more of a problem with mites are in those dry, kind of droughty years. Those drought summers are kind of the best summers for a fruit grower because, again, you're not dealing with the humidity and the rainfall. And as long as you can get them some, you know, a little bit of supplemental water, those drought summers are probably going to be your best fruit growing years. But this would be the thing to keep an eye on in a situation like that, would be mites. Woolly apple aphids, major problem. They will feed on the roots as well. So I tend to see these on some of my older trees and more in that interior part of the tree where it's a little bit more shaded. So knowing what you're looking for, there's, you know, spray guides out there on how to control. Codling moth, if you ever found a worm in an apple, chances are it's codling moth. Sometimes these guys are tricky. That old Grimes Golden tree that I have, it has a very open calyx, and a lot of times there's a worm in there and there's no hole because that egg developed and that larvae just went straight in the front door of the calyx there. So sometimes you can be surprised. There's no signs of damage on the outside skin, but there is a nice juicy worm on the inside. Again, your summer sprays are going to help to control those. Scale, you can have scale problems on young branches and on fruit in some cases. You can see peaches and apples here with scale problems. This is probably the biggest pest problem anymore. in that, you know, the marmorated stink bugs are here to stay. They damage fruit later in the season. We could have done a great job controlling everything else. The fruit is a couple weeks away from being ready, and these guys come in, and they are almost impossible to control in the adult stage. You know, we can hit these guys with insecticides, and you know, we may have killed the one that was exposed directly, but because there's so many, because they're such good flyers, you know, we get another wave of them a day or two later, and a lot of times we don't even see signs of the damage on the skin, but what you'll find is this corking right underneath. You know, and I've had a lot of apples with this stink bug damage this year. So there are some fruit bags. You know, the Japanese are very committed to you know, things looking nice and looking presentable in their stores. So a lot of their growing methods revolve around, you know, covering fruits in the orchard. Clemson has developed some kind of paper bags that are probably only practical for the hobbyist with a tree or two, but you can cover the fruits, less exposure to disease spores moving around, and less insect exposure. So peach brown rot, like fire blight, you know, it starts sort of at the bloom stage. And with like with brown rot or bitter rot in the apples, you know, it mummifies the fruit. This is just a Pandora's box here of more spores for next year. So good hygiene, good sanitation in the orchard, getting that source of inoculum out of the tree and out of the orchard is always where we start with control. And this is what it looks like at bloom. You can see, you know, it affects that blossom. Here it didn't even develop, you know, that's the just destroyed blossom here. But, you know, so it starts as early as it bloom, but it also can develop throughout the year, depending on how much old spores we have hiding in the cracks and crevices of the tree. So scab, it's largely a superficial disease. If all you have is a scab problem, then you're doing pretty good with peaches. Aside from the fruit pests with peaches, we can get these borers, lesser peach tree borer and the peach tree borer. So, you know, when we spray a tree, always with our cover sprays, you know, we're not just trying to hit the leaves and the fruit. Generally, we're trying to cover that plant for a lot of these pests. And depending on if we're using a fungicide, you know, again, a lot of those spores can also be on the bark. So, you know, we can hopefully knock out some of those disease spores, you know, by spraying the bark too. Borers. Curculio, it's a native insect. You know, it was here long before peach trees, so we have to deal with them. There is a labeled organic spray, Surround, which is a kaolin spray, and it can give you some level of protection. Curculios will damage apples as well, and you see curculio damage when you see kind of that D-shaped scar on an apple. But probably more of a pest in our peach. They're what's going to leave us with that worm in a peach. With plums, you will get this black knot disease. It's probably going to happen, especially if the plums are not really being managed and cared for. In a situation where you get this black knot, just pruning out or removing the tree if it's too infested. You can see this tree here. I'd probably just cut that thing out if it's that bad. All right, we'll start talking on some of these small fruits. Blueberries are an excellent plant for hobbyists, for homeowners. If we have a mixture of varieties, we can have a fruit season that's sometimes as early as late May, all the way until about August in our areas. So they are an excellent plant, but worth testing the soil because they are oftentimes not as easy as what we might think they are, and that's really related to our soil. So I think they're a beautiful plant. You get great fall color, you get nice spring blooms, that bell-shaped flower that hangs down. So to me, they have landscape potential aside from just rows and rows of bushes. And here are some of my lessons learned with blueberries. I did not do a soil test, but I felt like I was confident in knowing what I know. You know, they needed acidic soil. So when I set in these first row of plants, you know, I amended with some peat moss, knowing that peat moss is going to lower the pH. It's going to add that organic matter. And, you know, 2 years later, I was still having some struggling bushes. You can see the chlorosis here. Sent some images off because to me, it almost looked viral in how, you know, it was so chlorotic with shoots coming out. Our fruit specialist said, do a soil test, your pH is the problem. Okay, so you can see this whole report here. pH was not the problem, 4.9. That is straight center of the road for where a blueberry wants to be. However, my soil, 2,200 pounds of calcium per acre, 300 pounds of phosphorus per acre. I did not add lime, obviously, with, you know, the pH where it is. My soil natively, or how it was used prior to a house being developed there, raised this level of calcium to a point that growing blueberries is not ideal. And it doesn't talk about this stuff in our publication on blueberries and things like that. It only gives you this information in the soil test. But you can see it says if soil calcium is above 900 pounds, or if phosphorus is above 200 pounds, then your site is not well suited for blueberries. Try to find a better site. Well, you know, my plants were already in the ground and I was out of range for both of those. So, you know, just do a soil test prior to. I think I've cracked it a little bit in my subsequent plantings. I do more pre-planting to dilute that high nutrient mineral soil by using Lake Allatoona dredge soil, by using more soil conditioner. My third row of blueberries is not nearly as bad as that first row of blueberries. About the only problems aside from nutrient that you're going to have is mummyberry, which can be challenging. And mummyberry will overwinter in these what look like bird's nest fungi. So management, one of the best things you can do is just fresh new mulch every wintertime. A couple more inches every winter, and hopefully smother and cover up enough of these bird's nest fungi that are the mummyberry spores for next year. So cover those up. In some years, you may get kind of a very isolated outbreak of these azalea type caterpillars. When I've had them and when others have called, it's usually only on one plant or even on one branch in one plant. So in a situation like this, you know, don't get out the backpack sprayer and spray all of them. Just prune that branch out, throw them on the driveway, and the birds will get them or squish them. So I had some really bad mummyberry in my bushes this year. This was back in April, and you can see fruit is already set and that stem is dying back. Really gnarly type stuff. New shoots that were coming up out of the root crown were also dying back, looking pretty bad. This is one of the shoots that was dying back. So it kind of looks like that fire blight in apple. So thankfully they sort of weathered the storm and grew through it. It was only an issue there for about 2 weeks in April. So I pruned out as much as I could. I did get a fungicide or two sprayed during that period. And, you know, again, I'll put out new mulch again this winter. And, you know, it's probably one of those diseases like fire blight that when conditions are right, you just have to know to expect it and be on the lookout, be ready to prune it out, and maybe get some fungicide out there if you need to. Bunch grapes can be pretty challenging in that there is a native disease, bacterial disease, Pierce's disease, that will clog the xylem of the plant, just like fire blight. You know, it was here before these plants were here. So you have to commit to annual pruning, you know, removing last year's growth, because again, it moves down the cambial tissue. Hopefully doesn't reach 2-year-old wood and the cordon and the main trunk coming out of the ground. Um, and so that's probably the biggest management disease to worry about. Of course, then there's always the fruit rots, the bunch rots, and anthracnose. So I really like to steer people more towards muscadines than the bunch grapes. Bunch grapes are pretty challenging unless you're a very committed gardener. So, but muscadines, I'm on year 5 of having muscadines, and every year I love these plants more because again I did not spray them at all. I didn't even fertilize mine this year, and I am just picking buckets and buckets and buckets of fruit. So I appreciate them more every year. Let's see if I can get this video to play for you guys here. So if you've never eaten a muscadine, for folks that didn't grow up in Georgia or in the South, you may not be familiar, but they are not a table grape. They have a very thick skin, although some of them I will eat the skin on. They do have some pretty large seeds in there. But if you can train yourself to get past that, they are very, very nice to enjoy. And they're very fragrant. I mean, a bowl full of muscadines will sort of fill the kitchen with perfume. But this is generally how you're going to eat them, is you're just going to kind of squeeze them into your mouth, or you can pop them in your mouth and spit the skin and the seeds out later. But oops, let's see here. So with the muscadines, um, they need a longer warm season, sometimes up to 100+ days. So that's why their range is somewhat limited to the southeast. I mean, I guess they could grow in Southern California, but this is where they're native. And frost is really never a problem because they fruit or flower so much later. I mean, these things aren't flowering until generally May. So in terms of being adapted to both our climate and our unique diseases and insects, this is about the best plant that we have. There are self-fertile or male varieties and female varieties or varieties with imperfect flowers. So if we want one of the female or varieties that is has imperfect flowers, then we need to have a variety that has perfect flowers or is a quote male variety. And they need to be relatively close, within 50 feet or so of each other. These are very vigorous plants. About the only concern that you really have with them is building a strong enough trellis or infrastructure for them to grow on, because they will live for 100 years really if you let them, but they grow so much, and the weight of that fruit is quite heavy after, say, year 4, that a shoddy constructed trellis, these things will outgrow them and tear them down, and you don't want to be in a place where you're trying to repair trellis wires and infrastructure. So spend a little bit of time and build something that's gonna last, and be able to keep them upright. We're selling strawberries with this year's plant sale. They are strawberry plugs, so they'll have a root system, and I love strawberries in that they fit a nice niche in the landscape. They're a low growing, they're a ground cover, and they're one of our first fruits, if not the first fruit that comes ready. This year we were eating strawberries in April. So for most of us kind of hobbyist gardeners, we're going to probably use the matted row and grow these more of as a perennial. In production agriculture, they're going to use this plastic culture and treat these more as an annual plant, planted in the fall and harvested one time, and then the whole thing is done over. With us, they are more of a perennial with a seasonal maintenance of this time of year. We're going in and we're thinning out our planting, and any mother plants that are a little bit old, we're going to replace them. That's about all that we really do, aside from some mulching and really being on time to harvest, I think is the biggest thing to overcome with some of our diseases. Most of our diseases are just, those fruit rots that will start on there, and slugs. This year, because of COVID, we were home and we were able to pick strawberries every day in the spring, and we had more strawberries than we've ever had. And I think it was just because we kept the plants productive by keeping them picked on time. So you can see these two knuckleheads. This is Daisy. I think this is her first picture here in the slideshow. So again, if we want to get our kids and grandkids and young people involved in gardening and interested in eating fruits and vegetables, this is how you do it with fruits. Kale is probably going to not go over as well with these two as strawberries and muscadines and things like that. So I really love fruits just for this reason alone. Is there's sugar there, kids like them, I like them, of course, but very easy to grow. Some of our problems can be avoided by planting in pots or containers. Some of those slug problems and fruit rots and things like that. So you can always get around some things with, getting elevated, getting away from the soil. Let's see here, giving them some space. If we're putting in these plugs, about 2 foot of spacing is ideal, because again, they're going to be a perennial and they're going to start to spread. I don't know if I would pull flowers off like this says that first year, because really you can get fruits that very next year. This is a strawberry setup by a former beekeeper in our area. He's since moved off to the coast. But he had all these old barrels that he just, needed to get rid of, and made this elaborate hanging bed system with old honey barrels. Had his irrigation. You can see irrigation lines up here, and he grew strawberries because, he just didn't want to bend down and pick them anymore. So, the plant is adaptable in that it's low growing. It's basically a ground cover. So, work with the plant instead of against it. Blackberries, these are some of our blackberries. They're not those ditch type blackberries with all the thorns. They will get quite bigger. These improved varieties out of the University of Arkansas. So with blackberries, we're talking about the terminology of this is a perennial planting, but their growth cycle is a 2-year growth cycle. So 1 year it sends up that primocane shoot, and that's all it does is grow vegetatively. The second year, that same shoot then has flowers and fruit, and then it dies. So while that same planting, that root crown, has floricanes or fruiting tissue, it's also going to be sending up primocanes for next year as well. So you're kind of managing the plant with those two things in mind. Fruiting growth, it's not wood, but fruiting growth and vegetative growth. There are upright forms, and there are semi-trailing and trailing forms. Your upright forms, a simple kind of V-type trellis. Your semi-trailing would probably work being trained to a fence or something like that, but they're going to need something for you to kind of, tie them to, weave them in and out of. Otherwise, if they're allowed to just kind of be to themselves unkept, they may just kind of roll on the ground and not put that fruit up where you want to pick it and keep the weather and the mud splatter and everything else off of it. So very simple, that V-type trellis training method here. And that's only going to work for your erect or upright types. Your semi-trailing, this probably isn't enough of a system for them to get off the ground on. This is probably more of a form that we would do with raspberries. Raspberries aren't quite as vigorous and upright, so something that has maybe 3 wires is probably going to be a little bit better than a single wire or double wire type of V trellis. as we would use the blackberries. This is at our house. I've got raspberries here on this side and blackberries here on this side. I wish it still looked like this, nice and clean. I would say probably weed management is the biggest issue for most of us. You know, the first couple of years are pretty fine, but then after that, you know, weeds start coming in. And it can be a real challenge, you know, from a lot of the grasses, you know, the creeping Bermudas and things like that. I deal with horse nettle. So that can be a real challenge. And really, I think all of this, the lesson here is 1 year I didn't have the opportunity to go in with fresh, deep mulch in dormancy. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for me staying on top of weeds in this area. Like with a lot of things in the yard, I just bite off more than I can chew long term. So weed control, you know, there are grass specific herbicides if you want to use herbicides. If that's your main weed, controlling selectively broadleaf weeds in here is going to be pretty impossible because we can't do that safely around these plants. So really keeping good deep mulch around them is probably your best and sometimes only option for weed control. We do have a little bit of you know, an extended season with blackberries, probably not as much obviously as with, you know, say apples or blueberries. But to give you an idea, you know, the full ripening window for Clarksville, Arkansas, which is about where we are in the hardiness zone and weather conditions, you know, it can extend for about 6-ish weeks. And again, this is the first ripening, you know, the first ripening. That plant is probably going to ripen berries for about 3 weeks. So if you had, say, a Natchez, you know, maybe a Navajo or an Apache and a Chester, you know, you could potentially be picking blackberries for, you know, maybe something more like two months, you know, maybe 10 weeks or something like that. So always think about that, having a little bit of extra season extension with a couple of varieties. They will get some diseases. I mean, in a production agriculture setting, our blackberries, I think they estimate the top end of a planting to be 7 to 9 years. So eventually these diseases do kind of just begin to wear the plants out. So, and that's a challenge, is because, you know, the springtime is where a lot of these diseases like rust start to come on, and you've got to spray them, but, you know, the plants are also in bloom during that time too. So I think the key really is culling out overly infested plants when they exist, removing plants as soon as they are done, not the entire plants, but removing those floricanes as soon as they are done carrying fruit. So a lot of that inoculum is just going to continue on. So, you know, we're in the planting, you know, say end of June, at the latest end of July, to remove those floricanes that just got done carrying fruit. And we should hopefully have less disease kind of carry over and pass over by doing that and staying on time. All right, so our minor fruits, and I like to call some of these winners, and you know, some of them maybe maybe not. Unfortunately, I think I've sold some of these in our plant sales. So mulberries, we have a unique history with mulberries here in Canton and with a lot of places in the United States because of the silk industry. So mulberries were brought in thinking that we were going to start to compete on the international silk market, and that never happened. But the town of Etowah, Georgia, changed its name in the 1830s to Canton because that's where you know, Canton, China was producing all the silk. So fun little side story if you're ever at a trivia, but the silk industry never took off. There are native mulberries, the red mulberries, really quite nice. And you may have some in the area. You Probably if they're old enough, you're probably not going to be able to get to the fruit because it's going to be out at the terminals for the most part and probably out of reach, but it's a great wildlife plant. They are relatively fast growing, but if you're going to put one in, you know, keep it away from the house, keep it away from the driveway, because those fruits, if they don't drop, they will be a favorite tree for the birds, and the birds are going to litter everything up. So if we're choosing mulberries for the landscape, we want to choose the black mulberries, not the white mulberries. You can sometimes find those in the trade. The white mulberries are more prone to this mulberry popcorn disease. But really, they're a pretty carefree tree, pretty carefree among all of them. I'm going to say, you know, no real spray program needed. Liz Porter, a gardener friend, has got a couple mulberries, and you know, they're pretty nice. They're kind of like a blackberry, but a little more muted, like not quite as I don't know if it's the acidity's not there or something like that. So they're mildly sweet, whereas, you know, a blackberry is pretty flavorful, has a little bit more complexity to the fruit. But these are quite nice, and I'm sure they do well in, you know, jams and jellies and things like that. Some of the books on like permaculture and fruit gardening, alternative type fruit gardening, talk about using mulberries as like a nurse tree for some of our more desirable berries, like blueberries. And the thought is that, you know, the birds will go to the mulberry tree and leave your blueberries alone. But, you know, I think birds don't read the books. And I think where there's fruit, the birds are probably going to go, and they're not just going to say, we're only going to eat mulberries. But it's a good idea. I think it's, you know, it's worth somebody writing a book on. But currants, my grandfather had a nice red currant bush right on his chain link fence in the front yard, and I used to love nothing more as a little kid than to just walk by that thing and pick a handful of currants. They are a fun fruit. This is the white imperial variety in the yard here, and you can see that skin is kind of translucent. You can see right inside. It kind of looks like fish eggs or little eyeballs. So fun for any of us, fun especially for kids. And pretty tart, nice flavor. And again, something you got to grow if you want them, because of that thin skin, because of the way they come off the plant. Generally, they're going to leave a wet stem scar. You're not going to be able to buy these other than maybe at a local farmer's market, stuff that was picked just that day. So easy to grow. Decent fall color actually on the foliage. You know, and you can get by with just one bush. So if you want to just give them a try, just get one bush and put them in. I put in a gooseberry, I guess 2 years ago. And so these are the gooseberries in the same pot. So currants are a little bit smaller. Your gooseberries are going to be, you know, good blueberry size to them. And this is, they're all the same variety. It's just these were on the plant a little bit longer than the green ones. And so I think I got about, maybe this was the second picking. So a nice little harvest on one bush. Pomegranates. I've gone back and forth on pomegranates. Pomegranates, I think the biggest challenge in our area is really getting them to survive that first year or 2 years. I've put them in a couple different spots in the landscape, thinking that, well, you know, they need that sheltered environment. They need a microclimate right next to the house. And I think I had more problems where I gave them, you know, a brick wall with radiating heat, you know, western sun exposure. And really it's because if we think about those chill hours and how plants work, it's my theory on this situation was because they're low chill hour, 150 to 200 chill hour requirements, they meet that resting period requirement so early, and then they're going to start accumulating heat units. And right on the side of a brick wall where it gets afternoon sun, I was giving it more heat units radiating off of that brick. So I've since moved and put some in full sun right along that road. 2 of them got winter kill, dieback. You know, they come back. That's the thing. They do come back. but one of them has survived this last winter, and now I actually got fruit set. Here were the blooms back in April or May. So very, very nice plant from a landscape perspective. But again, I'm a fruit gardener at heart, so I want to see some fruit before I let this thing stay. And I think I've got 3 fruits on here, on this one bush this year. So, you know, it may get an opportunity to stick around in the landscape. It's important to know there are thorns, pretty sticky thorns. So do keep that in mind, but a very nice plant, easy to grow for the most part. You may get some anthracnose and fruit related disease issues, but little to no plant disease issues. The pawpaw, I won't talk too long on this. I finally got to try one of these this year, actually. A gardener friend down in Woodstock saved one for me. Unique taste, a lot of seeds, a lot of big seeds in something like this. But this is about the only fruit you're going to be able to grow in the shade. So if you do have that shaded backyard, you're probably limited to pawpaws. They can be difficult to transplant. So you may want to almost self-sow some seeds as opposed to paying money for a seedling, because they have a pretty deep taproot that first year or two. And they generally are going to grow in like creek bottom, river bottom type soil, and they're kind of a suckering type plant. So keep that in mind, because you may end up with kind of a thicket of pawpaw after quite a few years. They bloom relatively early. You can see this is, of course, down in Tifton though, but that's what they look like. Not very attractive or showy, I guess, from, you know, just walking by. The unique thing is that they're pollinated by flies and beetles, not bees. And, you know, so getting flies to pollinate sometimes as early as March can be a little bit challenging. And so these are some pictures from an orchard that specializes in pawpaws up in North Carolina. And the orchardist up there has to actually hang dead fish in his orchard to attract the flies that will pollinate these things. So pretty interesting. You can see how big that seed portion is of that fruit and how big those individual seeds are. So this is really what's limited this fruit to being more commercial and more useful beyond just kind of home use and cottage type use. Very, very nice. Again, it's very nice, but you know, you're talking about a lot of seeds in here and a relatively short storage life or shelf life. Once it's ripe, it needs to be used or eaten pretty quickly. Elderberries, you'll probably see these in the ditches. I had some elderberries at the house when we got there. They are a native. They are very, very nice. And you can see, you know, if Better Homes and Gardens and Southern Living and all those, you know, big landscape nursery companies start picking up plants and improving them, you know, they've got to have some good desirable traits. And, you know, so this is a more ornamental variety of the elderberry. Really pretty. I mean, this is far nicer than most Nandinas and things out there. So my experience with the few I had was, you know, it's more of a wildlife gardener type plant. You're going to get a lot of birds, and you're probably not going to see much fruit unless you're going to commit to, you know, bird proofing the plants. And most of us are not going to be able to or want to do that. So, but here was the bush, you know, before I tried to get rid of it. Very pretty, you know. Nice blooms, mildly fragrant, and you'll just see all sorts of activity, a lot of wasps on these blooms. So, you know, again, if you're just looking for a nice addition to the landscape, they're probably fine. Are they really a fruit that we're going to get much off of? Probably not. The Juneberry or serviceberry, interesting history on the serviceberry name or moniker. I didn't realize, you know, where that came from or why it was called serviceberry. So, up north, you know, at least 20, 30 years ago, when they had more traditional winters, funerals just didn't happen in the winter months. And So the service berry generally is one of the first things that bloom out in the springtime, and it got that name because that's when funeral services would start to be held again, was when the service berry was in bloom. Had a friend bring me some of these from the Georgia Tech campus. I guess there's a lot of them in and around the Georgia Tech campus. They're pretty okay. I compare the taste of the fruits to a mealy apple and a blueberry mixed. So, okay, probably good for cooking and, you know, different recipes like that. Are you going to just make a meal of them? Probably not. At least I'm not. I'm not saying I'm a fruit snob, but I've had better. But they are quite nice. They will get some of the same diseases because they're in that same family with apples. They will get some of those same diseases. So, you know, you're going to get a less than desirable fruit with a lot of the same disease issues. So, you know, again, that's a second strike for me about maybe not wanting to plant that one. The aronia or chokeberry, you'll find these in some of the trade catalogs. They're probably more of a culinary type of fruit. With a name like chokeberry, you can imagine what they taste like. They are highly astringent. So probably something better added to recipes than just eaten alone. But again, you can see this smaller shrub type form. The landscape nursery companies like Better Homes and Gardens and those guys are getting into improving cultivars. So this is one of the easier growing native varieties that, you know, if you added a few of these to your landscape with the expectation that they're just a landscape shrub, you know, maybe, you know, if you're making some jam or some wine or something like that a couple years from now, you can go pull some off and add something to, you know, what you're making. So can be a nice addition, but I would think of them more of as landscape plant with some culinary value. And you can just try one if you want to give them a try. The jujube or Chinese date, I am yet to eat one of these. I've seen them growing. They do have thorns. They do tend to be kind of thicket forming type of plants, so multi-stemmed. One of our master gardeners told me he used to grow one of these. So, you know, I think they're worth giving a try. And maybe just one or two in the landscape is probably all you would need, especially once they reach maturity. Pretty big seed in the center. But, you know, with a name like date, I like eating dates. They're high in sugar. They dry well. So I would think these are okay. I'll let you know more if I ever get to try one. Hardy kiwis, very similar in growth habit to our muscadines. I'm yet to put these in at the house, but I think one of these years I'm going to try. So similar to muscadines in that they are a perennial vine. They have male and female or perfect and imperfect plants. So you need that cross-pollination. I've had one gardener tell me they had to wait 6 years before they got fruit though. So I don't think it's necessarily that long, but it is at least a 3-year game while you train the cordons and then the spurs or fruiting wood off of that. Kuza dogwood is a landscape plant. I'm not saying this is a fruiting plant, but you will get fruit on it, and the fruit is pretty darn tasty. This is fruit. I was up in Fort Wayne, Indiana last year. This plant will also grow in our area, but absolutely gorgeous specimen. This is in a botanical garden. The fruits are edible, and they're really quite nice. You know, you're not going to make a meal out of them again, but the skin is kind of thicker and leathery. There were 2 big seeds in here, but had a really unique and quite nice taste. Kind of like a papaya, in my opinion. Another one kind of in that dogwood category is Cornus moss, Cornelian cherry. You know, again, more of a landscape plant. That early spring bloom is, you know, a showstopper, good fall color. And these are, you know, a little bit more usable in the kitchen than that Kuza dogwood. You don't have that thicker skin. But again, probably a hassle to, you know, pick too many of these and actually do something with them. But, you know, something that you could have in the landscape that you can, you know, do something with. This is a plant. I'm going to apologize if you have bought this from us in our plant sales in the past. This to me is more of a weed that has a fruit on it. It has been a scourge. You can see here on the back of our house, I put one in, and you read the literature on this thing, and it's a superfood, according to Dr. Oz and some of these others, which I guess it would have to be to overcome some of the things it has going against it. It's got thorns for one thing. These are little. You can see that's my same left hand here. Those are quite little. A lot of seeds in there, and so I guess it probably has a lot of nutritive value because of the seed content. But it has been a challenge keeping this in bounds. I think I eventually sprayed this and had to spray it a couple of times. So if you're going to put one of these in, or if you already have, hopefully you haven't had the problems I've had, keep them in a container or some kind of strategy to keep it in bounds, because it will root from these branches and just become a bit of a nuisance. So yeah, buyer beware. And sorry if you bought one from us in the years past. Some good publications. Our minor fruits is you're going to learn more about those jujube and pawpaw and all those other ones. And then we've got specific publications on a lot of these additional fruits. Our pest control handbook, I can show you where to find that. I'll minimize this. Cornell has some good stuff on smaller fruits. But do know that, they're Cornell, they're up in New York, so some of the recommendations they may have may be more specific to colder climates in the upper Northeast. So that home and garden pest management handbook, it's available online, it's absolutely free, and you would just go to this orchards and fruits section, and this is 36 pages on, each of our small fruit and tree fruits, and what our diseases are, what our insects are, and recommendations for the various growth stages and what we might try to use to keep things under control. GeorgiaWeather.net, you'll see all of our stations across the state. You can zoom in and see, ball ground or LJ, something like that. That calculator function is what I talked about with figuring out our chill hours. So we would click on chill hours, ball ground here. Like I said, I like to pick, somewhere maybe mid to even late November. We'll just say like November 20th, 2019 to, we'll do 1st of March for this year. And we'll choose between 32 and 45. So last winter season, it looks like we had 927 hours. Between that, freezing and 45 degrees. That's our chilling hours. And you can also get the information by doing calculators on first frost, last frost. If we're a vegetable gardener, rainfall, soil temperatures, all that stuff is right here on GeorgiaWeather.net. So great site for lots of good information. Guys, I didn't expect myself to go quite this long, so I haven't even looked at the chat box, but if you guys have questions, I'm still not great at Zoom here. So if you want to just unmute and maybe ask your questions, we can do them that way too.
Hey Josh, this is Deb Carr. How are you?
Hey Deb, I'm good. How you been?
Doing well, thanks. Hey, in the future, can you share a little bit more about espalier figs? And I've got to transplant some figs, so if that's a separate session you might do in the future, that's where my interests are.
Okay. Transplanting your figs, I mean, how big are they?
2 stories.
Oh, plant new ones, honestly. I would
How do I
plant new
get
ones.
rid of the how do I get rid of the current one then?
Yeah, you're probably going to need to use some herbicides to actually get rid of it. Because I mean, those roots, I've found root runners from just a 4 or 5 year old tree, well over 20, 25 feet away from the plant. So
Wow. Okay.
excavating that thing out of there, man, you're gonna, if it's on the corner of a house or anywhere near a house, that might get kind of hairy.
It's right in my septic
Ugh,
plat.
yeah. Oh man. I
Yeah.
I would try to get it sprayed. That's what I would try to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. But the
Yeah.
espalier part, interested in that too. So maybe another time, if not today.
Yeah, well, that's something I got to practice with. I think, because, and the nice thing about figs is they fruit on, current season's growth. So I think you're growing them almost more like a cordon, and then you're just training new shoots that would come up that you could then, kind of tie to a couple wires. So I think you would kind of have a system that goes like this: your trunk, your cordons, and then new shoots that would go up and be replaced each year. That's how
Cool,
I've seen them
thanks.
done.
Okay.
Yeah. Any more questions? You guys still there? Does everyone stay awake?
Hey, Josh, Mike Lloyd. I think you did an excellent job today. I appreciate you going through this.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's there's a lot to talk about with trying to cover everything, but hopefully we did enough of everything to give people the things to think about before they hopefully order plants from our plant sale. So.
Josh, what are the dates of your plant sale?
Pre-order now through the 23rd of October. Plants will then arrive on the 30th for pickup.
Hey, Josh, I got a question.
Sure.
So I've actually been trying to grow my fig tree just like you described. They call it a step over espalier.
Yeah.
But this year I've just gotten a ton of shoots from the base. And it seems like every time I thin them, I just get twice as many more.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how to heal that so that I can have the great, just the single trunk. But you'd see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, that's really the challenge with figs, and that's why, it's more of a small bush. We can let them grow to be a single trunk, a brown turkey or something like that will get the size of a 2-story house. But really, the nature of it kind of wants to be that, multi-trunk shrub type thing. So I wonder, I mean, there are PGRs or plant growth regulators that you can use for knocking back suckering. But I wonder if around the trunk, if you use some sort of either deeper mulch or plastic mulch, if you would cut off that ability for those suckers to come up.
Yeah, I could try plastic. I have a lot of deep mulch, but I also have a ton of green figs that just aren't ripening. And this is all from, so all I had basically was at the beginning of the season, with what you described, the trunk, and then the two, the branch kind of about a foot or two off the ground.
Yep.
And then all that upward growth has grown about 12 feet.
Yeah.
So, but just lots of green. And I'm not sure how to, I've probably only gotten a dozen figs off of it that actually ripened.
Yeah. So what I did just last week, and it's made the world of difference, is I went in again and kind of did that okra style pruning on mine. And then I also went into the tips, and those tips are pretty bad about sending off a bunch of extra shoots. I tried to remove as many of those shoots and just leaving that one primary as I could. And honestly, the last 2 days, we've gone out and picked handfuls of figs, whereas the rest of the season up to now, we've maybe gotten just a handful total prior to me doing that. So I would go in and thin out those shoots at the tips, remove as many of those, and maybe even remove some leaves, and see if you can't speed up ripening on a few of those before we start getting too cold for them to ripen.
Okay, and then just one more question on that. Is that all that sap that flows, that's not going to be an issue with introducing disease or anything?
Nah, I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah. I mean, the only real main disease with figs are going to be some of the, I think it's anthracnose on the fruits. Or really the only big problem I have is ants. And sometimes if the figs are on too long, they'll start to ferment at that blossom end. But I mean, that's about the only problem I've ever had with figs is, you know, that souring of the fig, ants in there, and wasps. No real disease issues.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful.
Yeah. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm 10 minutes into my lunch break, guys. I'll stay on as long as you want me to, but I've been talking to myself for 2 hours, it feels like, so.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great job, Josh.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Yeah, you were
Thanks,
not
Josh.
talking to yourself.
Thanks, Josh.
Well, this whole virtual thing, it feels like I'm here talking to myself. So I'm glad
did
you guys
great.
are there, and I'm glad I didn't bore you to sleep.
No, good stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Goodbye.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, just let me shut this off first.